Bismillah wa salatu wa salam ala Rasulullah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to another episode of the Islam Through the Ages podcast. I'm your host, Thaqib Musa, and I'm joined today by a very special guest. Joining us from the US is Dr. Ovamir Anjum. Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Ovamir.
Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
Real huge pleasure for us to have you. Dr. Anjum is the Imam Khattab Endowed Chair of Islamic Studies at the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies at the University of Toledo in Ohio. He's also a regular contributor to Yaqeen Institute. He contributes primarily on politics, siyasa, law, theology, falsafa, philosophy, spirituality, and talking about the intersection of politics and Islam. And they're very interesting YouTube videos, a lot of which I watched again in prep for this on Dr. Anjum talking about Ibn Taymiyyah and the kind of historical analysis of his. I think you started with your bachelor's in physics, which might be new knowledge for some of the listeners, and then continued on through your studies to do a master's in computer science and a PhD in Islamic intellectual history. So welcome and thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate you taking the time out today.
Thank you very much for having me.
So today we wanted to talk and kind of pick your brain a little bit on some of the concepts that, as you said, are so you're so passionate about. It's different approaches to Islamic history that have been taken throughout the time and throughout kind of the ages and the study, but also what approaches can we take and what approaches are constructive in analyzing the world of Islamic history. So kind of starting off, I wanted to kind of ask you about what are some of the different approaches to Islamic history. What kind of categories would you break them down into?
Okay, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalam ala Rasulillah. Islamic history, the idea of Islamic history, in a sense, is deeply Islamic, because if you look at the Quran, there is a sustained engagement with the past. And in fact, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala provides, if you will, a correction of earlier scriptures. But along with that, in the minds of a Muslim, even if there is sort of no other doctrine and no other development, just encounter with the Quran alerts you to the fact that there is history, there is a past. And then also that because these books were changed and corrupted, and that people responded to divine command in a way that sometimes was good and sometimes was not so good, but also they failed to preserve correctly the divine message. This also alerts Muslims already to an idea of history, an idea of scripture, an idea of preservation. So not only history, but history as measured through the standard of the book. And the Quran calls the people of the book, right? The people of the book, because the book, the text, the written text becomes the point of reference by which the communities that are worth mentioning, of all the millions of communities, right, God could have mentioned, communities that are worth mentioning are called Ahl al-Kitab, the people of the book. And similarly, many of the surahs in the Quran begin with that this is the book. So the idea of writing and preserving in history, the idea that most important things are those that are written down, that is very much part of this encounter with the Quran. And you find that in the hadith as well, because hadith sciences the preservation of the reports about the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the preservation of the biographies and character of those who preserved those reports also is quintessentially Islamic, because the idea that you have to know what the Prophet actually said through a method and a method that is objective and scientific, right? It's a method that non-Muslims can understand and appreciate and get involved in. It's not some kind of spiritual communication by which we know that, oh, if sounds good, it must be, the prophetic saying, right? So there is there is a uniquely Islamic attitude toward history as fact, not merely history as myth or history as religion or history as just what feels good, which is the case, in fact, to this day with many religious communities. So I think that Muslims have this special relationship to history. And as Islamic civilization grows and it became a very text-oriented civilization very quickly, even though it comes in the middle of an unlettered people. But the centrality of the Quran, right, it's almost writ large in the entire civilization, because it is the Quran that kickstarts the written culture. And written culture is, in a sense, qualitatively different from, more profound in some ways, much more detailed, much more given to complexity and sophistication than non-written cultures, oral culture. So in a sense, Islam becomes a very quickly a complex culture in which writing and becomes important. So history, in a sense, is religiously important to us. But there is another interesting way in which you could look at foundationally Islam's relationship to history. And for that, I have to perhaps back up a little bit. If you look at the Western discourse on history, there are two ways of looking at it. Greeks, it is said, did not have an idea of history in the sense that time was seen as circular, meaning nations, people went up and down, and they weren't moving toward a teleology, toward an end, toward some kingdom of heaven. That comes with the Abrahamic traditions. So the biblical tradition has a linear history, whereas the Greek tradition is seen as a circular view of time. The time is passing, but there is nothing that is qualitatively changing, that there is worth recording these details, because we aren't really moving toward anything definitive. And what one finds in the Quran is a combination of the two. That you find, of course, we are moving toward the Day of Judgment, but also there are laws of nature, sunan of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that created the kind of openness to laws and regularities in nature that the Greeks were alert to, because they thought of it in terms of that which is permanent, that which is, that's what's worth recording and knowing. So that's what they were more interested in laws. Whereas the biblical imagination, the Abrahamic tradition, Jews, and then Christians, was not really interested or couldn't really understand God in as understood through his regular acts. God's action in history was almost always a surprise in the Bible. Like, you don't know what God is going to do next. Forgive, not forgive these people, show another miracle, send somebody, a son who will change everything. So with the Quran, you have this very interesting sense that there is an attention to, if you will, laws and sunan of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as well as passing of time in a linear way. So in that sense, I argue that the Quranic notion of history is the fullest and the most sophisticated of compared to these two large mega traditions, because you basically get to do both social sciences and history. Looking at Muslims' own history of writing history, or history of historiography, there's a lot that has been done recently over the last century, 2 centuries, and you have the earliest recording of Islamic history is merely concerned with faithful preservation, so hadith collection. And history then becomes a branch of sort of hadith collection because it's done in the same way. X said what Y reported, and Z reported this on authority of such and such person. That's how you wrote history. And over time, another view of history developed, which is writing history as stories, as literature, as a storyline that is of interest in itself. And then over time, other views of history that became invested in knowing the rise and fall of political powers and practices that led to one or the other, the siyasa history. And finally, you then have a philosophical view of history. And I am giving you this classification based on work by Tarif Khalidi, a text that, if you're interested, you could look more into. So these four views of history were, if you will, classical Islamic Arabic views of history: hadith, literature, siyasa, and falsafa.
So I think you talked about kind of history, the way it's viewed in a Judeo-Christian or Islamic sense is linear. And when you say we're building up to at the end of it a kingdom of heaven of sorts, is that kind of, you mean the end of the world and then Qiyamah and then Jannah and Jahannam, or do you mean the notion that in dunya there will be a point where there will be a kingdom of heaven of sorts that the Mahdi and Isa alayhi salam will build for us, and that is the pinnacle of society? Or
And so, I mean, they're connected, but that what I was giving you is a Christian view, right? Jewish view is slightly different, which I'm not going to go into right now. But what my point is that Muslims have a belief in Yawm al-Qiyamah, that this world, this very world, is going to come to an end, and before that, there are going to be certain signs and certain events. But there is a linear component, meaning what is happening is not going to continue indefinitely.
okay,
Right? But there is also a circular component, if you will, which comes in from the fact that, as Allah says in the Quran, for every ummah, every nation, there is an appointed time beyond which they will not survive. And Allah talks about that, well, when the time of an ummah is decided, this is how the elite act with such decadence and so on. So it is as if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is pointing to certain laws, certain norms, which then get picked up by certain Muslim scholars such as Ibn Khaldun, before him Al-Mawardi and others. So my point is that there is both of these components, circular and linear.
okay. And I think so. You mentioned the kind of the four types, which is hadith preservation became the main focus, and then the telling of stories. Then we moved to the rise and fall and political. And I think, would you say something like the Ibn Khaldun story of history or the theories of history that Ibn Khaldun came up with? Are they part of the political history?
I think that Ibn Khaldun comes, uh, at this epitome of historical consciousness among Muslims. So, so he has all of these.
Okay.
So his method is attentive to the hadith sciences, and he does tell you a story. Especially if you look at his ibar, the actual work to which Prolegomena or the Muqaddimah was written, he does tell you a story and omits the isnad. So it's hadith. He's conscious to. He's aware of this hadith method. He follows it, but at the same time, he wants to focus on what one can learn from telling the story from beginning to end, regardless of who said it, and can be figure out what makes sense, what doesn't on that account. And then he introduces a whole new imagination to reading of and to the thinking about history, the history, a philosophy of history.
Okay. And I think you said these four methods are from Tariq Khalidi or
Tarif Khalidi,
Tariq
yeah.
Khalidi. Okay. Which again is something for us to follow on through, and for our listeners too as well. So when it comes down to kind of breaking it down as we usually look at it, when you mentioned the point of for every nation is أن لكل أمة أجل. We usually think of it and we usually look at it as dynasties. So the Umayyads had a time period and then they ended, and then the Abbasids came, and near the end of the Abbasids, then we had the rise of a few different dynasties. You had the Seljuk Rooms and the Turkic dynasties were rising. You had the Fatimids rising up, and then on the other side you had the Umayyads in Moorish Spain. So there's a kind of dynastic view, but what about looking at it from slightly unconventional, or you could say kind of out of the box views of kind of the networks, the history of the Sufi tariqas, for example, and how they developed, or the madrasa system. And I was very interested if you would elaborate on any works or something which focus on this, on the aspect of some thematic, like the history of women in Islam, that Sheikh Akram Nadwi in the UK has just kind of released his Muhaddithat magnum opus, the history of dynasties, or the history of madrasa system, or any works that have been done like this, or any categorizations like this.
Yeah, so when history was written in the Islamic period, it wasn't really the stereotype that we often think about, that it's one damn thing after another, and it's the it's who became Khalifa when. There was actually almost so history was very biased toward ulama, literary class at first. The ulama began writing about themselves. In particular, the masters of this tradition were the muhaddithun, because that was their job, to figure out asma al-rijal, right? And who could meet whom. So they had to know what the cities were, and who lived when, and whether it's even possible that these two people could have met, and what was said about them. So that really, this became this tabaqat literature. You see, the idea of tabaqa, a generation, is a very natural way of looking at history. In fact, even in modern historiography, there is new appreciation of understanding history through generations. But that was very naturally the way the Muslims looked at it, because of this hadith focus. Because the idea was that, how many generations did you have between certain narrator and the Prophet, alayhi salam, and then you would try to figure. Now, from that, what happened is that fuqaha began to write their tabaqat. So jurists would write about who the great jurists were in every city in their madhab, and then people who belonged to different guilds and different sana'at, different sort of industries, they began to write about their tabaqat. The Sufism really comes of age when you have people like Abdurrahman al-Sulami and al-Qushayri and al-Hijwiri writing tabaqat of the Sufis. So you find that, in fact, in the primary literature, primary sources in Islamic history, that's how you find the best stuff, these biographical dictionaries in every tradition. And this also has phases. So I like to divide up Islamic history into 3 century periods. The first century, 3 centuries, formative period, and then the next 3 centuries is what we may call early middle period, 4th, 5th, 6th centuries, early 7th, and then late middle period after the Mongols. So the Mongol onslaught is the big dividing line between early and late middle period. That's another 3 centuries after the Mongols, and it ends with the rise of the Ottomans, the Mughals, and the Safavids in the early modern period. And as we have 3 centuries of this what is early modern period. And of course, we are importing this terminology from the West, because modernity is something that becomes a point of reference in the West. And then you have, if you will, we are toward the end of this another 3 centuries of modernity. So if you think of it this way, the formative period is a period of great central caliphate. It starts with the Prophet ﷺ and the Rashidun, and then the Umayyads and the early Abbasids. The next period, what is early middle period, also called the classical period, this is where you begin to see an explosion of sort of Islamic scholarship. I mean, you have that in the formative period as well, but this is when there is a standardization and establishment of schools in jurisprudence, in theology, and in the Arabic language and everything else. And there is historical imagination that at this time, and then you have the Mongols. And after the Mongols, in the late medieval period, that is the best period for Islamic history. This is when all of this early, you have now basically, if you're a historian in this period, you have 6 centuries of material from Islamic civilization that now you can digest and you can think about and you can organize differently, and now you have enough evaluations of hadith stuff that you can figure out, what is what and who's who. So you have a lot of great compendia that are being written this time. And this is also the time when everybody begins to write history of their own craft. Right, so the Mamluk period, if you will, post-Mongol world, Mamluk period, this is the time when Ibn Taymiyyah is writing. This is the time when Ibn Khaldun is writing. This is the time when Shatibi is writing. And one of the reasons why these people are so massive and encyclopedic in their scholarship compared to even what came before is because you have this this knowledge available, and this historical consciousness that is new.
So when you talk about these kind of different epochs, and I really like the way you divided them into 4. I was still kind of trying to wrap my head around, because usually we look at it as you have the Rashidun Caliphate, and then you have this unbreaking chain of one central caliphate, which isn't, of course, the case, because actually, for the longest time, the Umayyads didn't accept the Abbasids, and for the longest, then they became puppet rulers. At what point do you think modernity is kind of, or what thing is symbolic of the age where kind of the Islamic history enters modernity? I think you mentioned the last 3 centuries or so. So would you say something like the start of colonization?
So before I talk about modernity, let me add to something that you said and perhaps correct it a little bit. The idea, and I think that you're absolutely right to observe that there is this this black box of history that we have after the Rashidun period, right? And this idea really is damaging to any serious understanding of history, because things change fundamentally, deeply. Some things are getting worse and some things are getting better. So the idea that everything goes downhill from there is just plain wrong. You see, people like you and me who are trying to understand, and those better than us who are trying to do something, they have been trying to do that throughout, and their efforts have not been fruitless. So, for instance, if you look at just simple things as hadith, knowledge of what the Prophet ﷺ said, in the 3rd century, you have much more of that knowledge organized than you have in late 1st century. Right? In late 1st century, an ordinary Muslim they were regionally limited. They would not know what the Prophet ﷺ said if, it wasn't available in their city, and you didn't have these compilations available. In 2nd century, this begins and takes off, and by 3rd century, so you have a much better knowledge of what the Prophet ﷺ says, much more organized. Similarly, in fiqh, right? The 1st century fiqh is incomparably simpler, but also in some ways less sophisticated. Even one could say in many centers away from the main centers, it would be less Islamic, because people simply would be using their local understanding, whereas when you have the schools of fiqh emerge of Abu Hanifa in Iraq and Malik in Medina and Shafi'i, and then they begin to argue with each other, and the result you have increasing legal sophistication and increasing encounter with the texts that are relevant. by second and then third century, you have much more worked out Islamic law. So the idea that we are going downhill is just patently false. Now, in some way, in terms of our orientation to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and nearness to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, of course, the first three generations are hands down closest to the Prophet and the best among them. And we should not think about this in a simple demographic terms that all Muslims at the time were like that. But the people who were close to the Prophet and then those who learned from the Sahaba, of course, these people were in some way the source of all religious knowledge and all religious virtue. But in many other respects, Islamic civilization sees ups and downs and ups again. And this is very, very important to emphasize that you have in Islamic history really problems pose themselves. The problem of, for example, we don't know what the Prophet said because people are trying to make up all kind of stuff. And a solution is found, and solution is so spectacular, so magnificent that no other human civilization has anything like it until the modern period. Right? A critical analysis of these hundreds of thousands of reports and a deep knowledge of what the Prophet was like, alayhi salatu wasalam, day to day. That was a remarkable achievement, and that took hundreds of thousands of people full time dedicated to do that. So this middle history, and similarly, you have other problems. The problem appear intellectually, the problems of philosophical incursion, and then response to that and resolution. All of these things are extremely important to understand that there's history is dynamic. So when you say Islamic history is dynamic, in my view, that's what it means. That problems are appearing and solutions are appearing. And today, when we think about this, our great past, when you learn about this dynamic history, you have a tremendous wealth of wisdom, not just information, but great wisdom that comes from dealing with people who are in some ways far superior to us in the way that they have digested these problems. Yet we are also, in some ways, our knowledge and our access to data is far superior to theirs. So there are things that we can do that they couldn't do. And so one last thing I want to say is that this era where we are today, in the last few decades, is perhaps the best time to be in if you're into Islamic history. That, in fact, both Orientalist, Western scholars, but also Muslim scholars, often when challenged by colonizers and Orientalist scholarship, have not been sitting around. They, in fact, in the Arabic-speaking world in particular, but other languages, and Muslims writing in English and in European languages, have produced a tremendous amount of scholarship that is unprecedented. And so we know a lot more. And the challenge is often for ordinary Muslims to, deal with the problem that this knowledge may challenge their deeply held beliefs sometimes. Islam is a fact-friendly religion. And so alhamdulillah, you find that, you may have, history may pose a serious problem, a debilitating problem for Christians and Jews or whatnot. But in fact, for Muslims, it doesn't. In fact, it is often reassuring. Yet at the same time, many myths that are not central to our faith and understanding, yet they become the anchors through which we understand. Those myths sometimes may be challenged. But I think that on the whole, engagement with history is extremely enriching, number one. Number two, it is transformative. You cannot be the same before and after engaging with it. And number three, it is in some ways it is the paradigm. It's the paradigmatic science of our time, right? So there was a time when philosophy was big because didn't have a lot of data. But you could sit back and think about the few things that you did know. Today, and this includes the Western world, philosophy has been overwhelmed by data, and either in science or human in human realm by history. So much of philosophy today is to grapple with history. So in that sense, people may even feel intimidated by history because history seems to be overwhelming everything else. But I think that in some ways, it is a good thing.
So I think when we generally, I think you mentioned something really positive, which is that actually it's a great time to be part of Islamic history because it's actually to the point where we have so much information, it's overwhelming. I think a lot of people feel that as soon as you start reading history, we're at the worst point that we've ever been in Islamic history. And again, looking back at some of these periods, especially the early middle, well, just at the end of the Mamluks, right after kind of some of these books were written, and right after we reached a peak, came the time of the Mongols. 100 years ago, there is the case where we lost kind of every major city there was under Islamic control. We lost Delhi, Agra, all those places were under British control, Cairo, Baghdad, even Istanbul. So do you think right now are we at a low going into an up? Are we still slumping and we're lower than we were 100 years ago? Do you think at Mongol times, when Baghdad had just been decimated and burned and the rivers ran black with ink and people blood came up to the horses' knees, was that a more difficult period than we are in now? Because looking around, it seems a little depressing. And
No, I think that you're right in almost every observation you made. And I think that in some ways, however, it's a great time to be a Muslim, and especially if you're willing to deal with knowledge. Knowledge is the challenge of today. Data uh, that we cannot avoid, but Muslims today are more aware of their history, and Muslims are more interconnected, by the way, today than they have been in a very long time. Muslims are more aware of, on the whole, just demographically speaking, more Muslims are literate and more Muslims are aware of the early Islamic history of the Quran and the Sunnah than ever before, simply by virtue of the fact that we have um, access to these books and these teachings. And I think that in some ways that presents a great opportunity. Now, we have lost continuous link to certain traditions, or rather it has become attenuated, but that should not blind us to the great opportunity that all of this presents to us. I think that we're living in a period where um, we can really only go up, but in many ways I see signs of that.
and we
In fact, just 20 years ago, when I was going to graduate school, a lot of what I see today, in terms of real engagement with Islam among young people, was not really possible. The Western world looked very differently, very different. The Western body of knowledge was presented in a very different way, even though it's at the same time that there are a lot of good work that was challenging this stuff was going on. You see, one of the things is that that's interesting to me is there is this inertia, and it takes time for results of things that you're working on to show. And this goes both in good and bad directions. So maybe there are bad trends that are accumulating that we won't really know how devastating they are to our family, to our community, to our faith until 10, 20 years down the line. Maybe young people are not really getting married. Maybe that they are losing their faith. Maybe it is that um, we have surprises waiting for us. But at the same time, um, more young people today across the world, and I'm speaking of the Muslim world as well, are learning languages through which they can talk to each other. There is greater consciousness of there being a Muslim ummah than there has been in generations. Uh, in some ways, we are more aware of our great classical tradition than Muslims have been in centuries. This goes before even the colonial period. And you know, Ahmed al-Shamsi, who's a dear friend and a wonderful historian at the University of Chicago, his recent book Rediscovering Islamic Classics mentions how Muslims working on this stuff, reformist scholars in early 20th century, editors and publishers brought those books back from Europe and brought them back to life. And that has, over a period of a century, really changed and matured our understanding of Islam.
So I think you mentioned that point and where Orientals or Westerners, when they Europeans through colonization, actually rediscovered some of the classics. It kind of gives the and I think you mentioned that scholars haven't been sitting here. Actually, they've been formulating a lot of returns, but it feels like there's been a little bit of regression in scholarship over the past 200 years, or people have become more insular. When we talk about it in modern communities, if you look at discourse in a lot of Muslim countries, Pakistan, Turkey, etc., the religious class are looked at kind of these are the backward people. They don't know what's going on, and kind of is there a relationship between that and colonization? Is that how have we come to a point where we seem to have lost confidence in the ability to kind of express ourselves or create our own knowledge, even tell our own narrative, tell our own history?
Yeah, so I think that that was a result of the fact that there is, first of all, this great encounter with new knowledge. And that knowledge is coming from the West, right? That's obviously a fact. But what we don't appreciate often is that it has destroyed the West's self-confidence as well. You see, one of the things that these postmodernists and Foucauldian people do not understand about knowledge is that it is power, but it is not power that you wield. Knowledge has the truth and fact and power of its own. And one of the things that has happened as a result of these new discoveries about the Western discoveries about itself, if you can talk about an it, which is obviously a gross simplification, but as a result, you have this whole young generation of educated Westerners who are rebelling against the West's colonial and then post-colonial and imperialist institutions and agendas that are so deeply formative of the current situation. But anyone who is sort of becomes aware of this seriously also becomes engaged in critique of it. And we're becoming aware of the fact that this world was not just created by the white man. But the same kind of challenge Muslims cannot avoid. That if we had cherished myths that kept us going, then those will need to be replaced with better supported ideas. That said, it is true that colonialism destroyed a beautiful world that was not without its deep flaws, and in some ways it was rotting. And it's always the job of a historian to figure out the tensions and the harmony in any society, and you basically can pick which one you want to focus on. When Muslim historians today, Muslim scholars, focus on the West's distortion of the Muslim world, right? That's obviously that's something that's going on, and that's extremely important, and has been largely a successful enterprise at the academic level. Many of those cherished Orientalist myths about how the Muslim world was, in science, all they did was just transferred this to us, and they just and there was a civilization of just violence and so on. All of those cannot be sustained. Yet at the same time, this new knowledge that has presented this challenge to the West has presented a challenge to everybody. And now another kind of scholarship is equally important, which is for us to deal with our knowledge, and the knowledge that is available to us, the neutral knowledge. It's not all knowledge is a tainted conspiracy of modernity. If you're going to ever encounter the world that God created and never let go, we should never think of that world as unredeemable because it's tainted by modernity, right? So modernity for some people has become almost the devil incarnate, as if it itself is an evil. And I think that is also an error. So we need scholars who can engage with our own tradition in a way that is critical and at the same time confident, right? And this goes for Islamic history and what Islamic historical knowledge teaches us about our cherished ideals.
Picking on one of those kind of myths is when we usually hear about kind of the Caliphate and Christendom, we kind of always view it as clash of civilizations. There's a series of books by, I think, James Reston Jr., where he goes through each period, and it's Dogs of God, Saladin versus Richard the Lionheart, and then like every period he picks someone who's kind of pitted against each other, and this is very common. Is that completely true? Is it true to say that the Ottoman conquests of kind of the Balkans and Eastern Europe, they were all inherently religious, and the response to them was inherently Christian? Even the Crusades, were they truly religious wars? And is there a wider relationship between Caliphate and Christendom other than just conflict?
So I think you're asking a number of very important questions, and I don't think that the answer can be a dichotomous yes or no, because Crusades could be deeply religious, yet at the same time there could be a lot else going on, right? I mean, there is an assumption in your question, perhaps, that because it was religious, it wasn't an interchange, an exchange. So for it to be truly fruitful and friendly, it had to be non-religious. And often it was the other way around, that if you could reach down to your deep, religiosity and encounter the religiosity of the other, that is when you would find reasons for respect and friendship. But when you are motivated by an agenda that is territorial, the thing about knowledge and spirituality is that it can be shared. The thing about territory and wealth is that it is a zero-sum game. So often people don't appreciate that. So I'll give you a couple examples. The Crusaders, if you look at the account of the crusading zeal, it is deeply, deeply religious. And nobody can read manuals or and chronicles of crusaders and say, well, these people were just motivated by plunder. That's just not the case. The Westerners, by the way, Western scholars were doing the same thing to early Islamic conquests. This was just plunder, as they're doing to their own crusades. In fact, they perhaps honed their skills on crusades, which is look at everything in a secular term and then apply it to. So I think but if you look deeply at what was going on in crusades, you have common people, masses? Do you have deep inequality? You have a church that is trying to, in the 11th century Europe, trying to consolidate power in its own hands. Pope Urban II at Claremont gives this speech that the Christian communities in the West, in the Muslim world, are being destroyed, and these Saracens are destroying them. They are pagans, they're heathens. Let's go reclaim them in the name of Christ. For the vast majority of Crusaders, this was the truth, and this was salvation. Now, what led Pope Urban II to say what he said was part of a long-term agenda of misinformation about Islam, Muslims as pagans and heathens, as moon worshippers, which had been carefully created because Christians who encountered Islam felt deeply threatened. They felt deeply threatened because it is extremely close, and because Muslims did not deny Jesus alayhi salam or Mary alayhi salam, and many of the miracles and what is in the Bible you can find so deeply resonating in the Quran that you are not likely, if you're a deep Christian, to set it aside. So this meant that the church needed to, in order to maintain its authority and its business, it needed to create a very powerful propaganda. So I think that Crusaders were built on that. Doesn't mean the Crusaders were not necessarily religiously sincere, but they were built on centuries of insincerities and lies, or perhaps sincere lies, by clergy and monks and folks who had been, who had controlled the knowledge.
But it drove them to a point where some of the Christians, like Eastern Orthodox Christians, who had actually spent more time with Muslims, and maybe were still foreign to those Western Europeans coming in. I think it was the fourth or fifth Crusade where they sacked
Rome.
Constantinople. Yeah.
Right. Absolutely. So this was the other thing I was going to say, that there was a difference between Latin West and Greek-speaking Eastern Christianity, and the interaction between them was parallel in the interaction between the Seljuks and the Fatimids in Cairo. So their internal rivalries were stronger in their minds than rivalries they had toward Christianity. In fact, there is one report that Alexius, the Roman, the emperor of Constantinople, emperor of East Roman Empire, Byzantine emperor, sent a message to Kilij Arslan, the Seljuk prince, that these guys are coming, right? Basically, as Westerners arrived in Constantinople, they were horrified by it, and they said, "Okay, just get out of our city. You're destroying it." And then he sent a message to them, basically telling them that these guys are coming, but Muslims or Seljuk leaders did not take it too seriously. Like a bunch of hooligans coming. But that shows you that Alexius was more interested in keeping long-term peaceful relations with the Muslims than with these guys who came from far away. And yes, you shared religion with them, but you didn't share a level of civility with them. And in some ways, they were foreigners. And the same thing, when Crusaders arrived in Jerusalem, they found the Eastern Christians to be non-Christian. They were more like Muslims, and you couldn't really recognize them. And we don't have to talk about what happened 1,000 years ago. If you talk to most Christians today, most American Christians, for example, they're not really willing to recognize and deal with the fact that they're in Egypt and Syria and elsewhere. There are Christians who have much longer history and depth with Christianity than they do. So, and internally, of course, Christians are very deeply divided. I remember it's one of the very interesting things that when I teach a class, a general class in world religions, I often have my Protestant students when you ask them to name a non-Christian religion, they would name Catholicism. So these are different religions to them. And people, of course, have this myopic view, and that was very much the case in the world that we are talking about as well. So people made all kinds of alliances that were not defined by this religious identity.
I think to kind of widen the scope, to widen the scope, just as we're kind of coming to a close. The point you mentioned about these Saracens. So the Crusades focused on this point of these Saracens are kind of the infidels and things like that. And even now, a lot of the time when they talk about Islamic history, they talk about Egypt and Syria and Saudi Arabia and those places. Do you think there's a kind of an intense focus on the North Africa and Middle East and North Africa region, rather than looking kind of wider, where Islamic history and the Islamic world stretches? In fact, very quickly the focus shifted, and a lot of the things that actually Islamic culture brought in the Abbasid period, for example, was a lot imported from Persian culture, Persian administration. A lot of Turkic culture was imported in, and of course in India we have a rich kind of development over 4, 5, 600 years of a completely different culture. That's not even talking about kind of, if you go far to the west, you have the communities of Mali, the Songhai, etc. So where do these peripheral regions come in, and at what point does a region become Islamic, like Mauritania, which is kind of a seat of great Islamic learning, Timbuktu, which was a kind of huge, full of scholars at a time. Where does that come in, and how do we even define what Islamic culture is, or what the Islamic world is, in kind of this world of nation states and all of that?
So if you're pointing to the fact that we tend to um, uh, we tend to conflate Middle East or Arab with Islam, that obviously is the case, and that obviously is a very much as a problem. It's a problem that's very much contemporary problem, And what's really interesting is that in the Crusader period, the enemy was called a Turk. So the conflation was not between Arabs and Muslims, but between Turks and Muslims. And that was also the case in the Ottoman period. For a very long time, people would have confused Islam with the Turks in the West. So it's a modern situation where Islam and Arabness have become interchangeable in people's minds. That probably has something to do with late 20th century history of the United States and the Arab world. But be that as it may, in the non-Arabs played a central defining role in an Islamic history. In fact, before the Mongols, the Islamic world was defined by, and most of the scholars came from the East, either Persia or further Central Asia. Right? Most of our Hadith scholars, for example, are Central Asians or from Khorasan. And that the same is true of our fuqaha and so on. It doesn't mean that the Arabs disappeared, but that but for the simple fact that the Arabs were a relatively smaller population, as non-Muslim as non-Arabs converted to Islam, and these people were used to various kinds of sophisticated scholarly discourse and more city life. They brought in great sophistication and great devotion to Islamic knowledge that became defining of our civilization, our culture. After the Mongols, however, there is a divide between the Persianate East and Arabic West. So Cairo and Damascus become centers of learning really after the Mongols, and these are Arab centers of Arabic. And that is when much of our the final form of great Islamic scholarship that starts in the formative period, grows up and is consolidated in this next classical period. It reaches its final age of maturity in the Mamluk period. And that's why, whether you're looking at books on usul al-fiqh or fiqh or kalam, or even falsafa, um, language, all of them are written in the Mamluk period. And that's simply a matter of, each period is receiving what it gets and is improving. And in some ways, the improvement is quite significant. Um, and that's, I think, one of the reasons why when people talk about, even in the circles of talabat al-ilm, people who are going and acquiring Islamic knowledge, they're likely to refer to a manual of or a scholar from this period. But I think that one final point that perhaps I did not pick up on enough is the role of non-Arabs, in particular Africans and Turks and Indian Muslims and Southeast Asian Muslims in Islamic civilization, which over time, as Islam spreads in these regions, it becomes quite significant. I guess one last point I want to make, I don't think I'll be able to do any justice to African Islam in Africa, for example. You can't really do without talking about al-Murabitun and then al-Muwahhidun and the really, really rich, profound developments in those traditions. But one thing I want to say in reference to an earlier question that you raised about the Mongol period and how they had destroyed Baghdad, which was the center of Islamic scholarship, which was the center of scholarship that was really oriented toward the east. So many scholars came from east of Baghdad because of the Persian connection of the Abbasids. But after that, one of the things that you find quite remarkable is that there is a phase of expansion of Islam into new regions, including Africa and Anatolia and Southeast Asia, that takes place after this Mongol onslaught, after this time when people thought Islam was over. In fact, they thought the world was over, and we're really just waiting for death and Gog and Magog. And then you have expansion of Islam into new regions in the century and two after that. So that also, I think, it's an important message, important lesson to remember, that things are not what they seem, and sometimes this kind of pressure is needed in order to force us to look at new horizons.
Okay, Jazakallah khair. Really, really appreciate that. I think that's been a kind of great overview, a lot of things coming together, and I've kind of just been scribbling down some little notes for further reading. So really appreciate your time. We really enjoyed this. I know you're writing a survey of Islamic history, which I think is potentially to be titled "History of Islam in Action." So we really look forward to reading that, hearing about it more. And we would really love to have you on in the future for a future episode where we can really dive deep into one of these topics and really benefit from your expertise again. So once again, Jazakallah khair for your time. We really enjoyed, and I hope you got kind of something out of it as well, and enjoyed
Oh,
as
no, it
much
was
as we did.
wonderful talking to you and uplifting as well. Great. Thank you very much to you and to Khalid.
Okay.
And I'd love to come back on some of the time, inshallah.
Inshallah, Jazakallah khair.